On an electrifying evening that will be etched into the annals of British history, the United Kingdom's political elite found themselves teetering on the edge of an abyss. At the heart of this seismic upheaval stood Nigel Farage, a man long vilified, ridiculed, and dismissed by the establishment, yet now wielding a weapon so potent it left a veteran television host speechless and the nation gasping in disbelief. What transpired was no mere debate. It was a cataclysmic reckoning, a blistering assault on the veiled machinations of the Labour Party that threatens to unravel the very fabric of British democracy. With the eyes of millions fixed upon him, Farage tore through the facade of political propriety, exposing a web of deceit, secret deals, and betrayals so profound they could shake the foundations of this proud nation to their core. Before we plunge into this earth-shattering saga, we implore you, yes, you, the discerning viewer, to join us in this critical moment. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let your voice be heard as we peel back the layers of this scandal together. And if you hunger for truth, if you refuse to let the establishment bury these revelations in silence, subscribe to our channel now. Don't wait, every second counts, and your subscription could be the spark that ignites a movement to reclaim Britain's future. Hit that button, join the fight, and stay with us as we uncover the shocking details of this historic night. The stage was set in a television studio, a seemingly innocuous arena where the usual parade of polished politicians and rehearsed talking points typically unfolds. A seasoned host, flanked by a panel of esteemed political analysts, anticipated a routine exchange. Perhaps a few sharp words, a sprinkle of predictable rhetoric, nothing more. But the moment Nigel Farage strode into that room, an invisible tremor rippled through the air. The atmosphere thickened with foreboding, the host's confident demeanor faltered, and the panelists exchanged furtive, anxious glances. They had faced Farage before, weathered his barbs and bravado, but this time, something was different. This time, he carried not just words, but a devastating arsenal of truth, hard, irrefutable facts that would soon detonate like a bombshell in the heart of the British establishment. As the cameras rolled and millions watched in rapt attention, Farage took his seat, his presence commanding the room like a general poised for battle. The host, attempting to maintain his grip on the proceedings, opened with a standard prompt. But before he could finish, Farage leaned forward, his eyes piercing the lens as if staring into the soul of every citizen watching. "British democracy is under siege," he declared, his voice a thunderclap that silenced the studio. "And Keir Starmer's Labour Party is the architect of its destruction." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, as the host faltered, his rehearsed poise crumbling. For a fleeting moment, it seemed he might regain control, but Farage pressed on, relentless and unflinching. "For years, we've been fed a fairy tale, that our votes matter, that our leaders serve us, that we live in a free and sovereign nation. But it's a lie, a grotesque, calculated lie, and I'm here to prove it." The room froze. The host, visibly rattled, stammered a weak rebuttal. "Nigel, that's a grave accusation. Are you suggesting Labour is—" But Farage cut him off with the precision of a guillotine. "I'm not suggesting anything," he snapped, reaching into a folder and brandishing a document for the cameras. "I'm showing you the evidence, right here, right now." The panelists craned their necks, desperate to glimpse the paper that Farage clutched like a sword. The host, his papers trembling in his hands, could only watch as the man before him dismantled decades of carefully curated illusions. "This," Farage said, tapping the page with a force that echoed through the studio, "is just the beginning." What followed was not a debate, but a revelation, a relentless unmasking of a political class that had long operated in the shadows, cloaked in platitudes and promises while orchestrating a betrayal of staggering proportions. Farage's voice, steady and resolute, sliced through the tension as he laid bare the Labour Party's duplicity. "They stand before you, claiming to champion the working class, vowing to protect British jobs, families, and sovereignty," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "But behind closed doors, it's a different tale entirely. Take this, an internal Labour memo from last year, detailing clandestine meetings with corporate titans, foreign influencers, and EU negotiators. Here, in black and white, senior Labour officials admit to keeping their public promises vague while secretly pledging allegiance to powers beyond our borders." The host, now a mere spectator to the unfolding drama, attempted to interject, but Farage was a force unstoppable. "Listen to this," he continued, his voice rising as he quoted the document. "We must ensure our public stance aligns with voter concerns while privately maintaining assurances to our European partners on regulatory alignment." Do you grasp what that means? It means Labour has been lying to you, brazenly, shamelessly, promising to honor Brexit in public while plotting its demise in private. A murmur of shock rippled through the audience, the implications sinking in like a dagger to the heart of the nation. This was no mere political maneuver. This was a calculated assault on the will of 17.4 million Britons who had dared to defy the establishment in 2016. But Farage was only warming up. With the precision of a surgeon and the ferocity of a lion, he produced another document, holding it aloft like a trophy of war. "And if that doesn't outrage you, wait until you hear this," he said, his eyes blazing with righteous fury. "Here's a leaked report on Labour's so-called immigration strategy. They've told you time and again they're committed to controlling our borders, haven't they? But behind the scenes, they've been singing a different tune. This paper reveals secret talks with international organizations to ramp up immigration quotas under the flimsy pretext of economic necessity, all while publicly pretending to tighten the reins. They're not just misleading you, they're mocking you, treating you like fools too dim to see through their charade." The host, his face a mask of perspiration and panic, could barely muster a response. "Nigel, these are explosive claims. Are you saying Labour has deliberately deceived the electorate?" Farage leaned in, his gaze unyielding. "No," he said, his voice a low growl that sent shivers down spines. "I'm saying it's worse than that. I'm saying they've turned their backs on the British people entirely, trading your trust for power, your future for profit, your country for a seat at the globalist table." The studio fell into a stunned hush, the weight of his words pressing down like a storm cloud ready to burst. The painelists, once eager to spar, now sat mute, their eyes darting anywhere but at the man who had just exposed their world for what it truly was. This was no longer a discussion. It was a demolition. Farage had come armed not with rhetoric, but with proof, tangible, damning proof that the Labour Party, under Keir Starmer's stewardship, had woven a tapestry of treachery so intricate it threatened to strangle the very soul of Britain. The host, desperate to claw back some semblance of authority, ventured a feeble defense. "Nigel, negotiations happen behind closed doors all the time. Surely this doesn't mean there's a conspiracy against the people." Farage's lips curled into a sardonic smirk, his response dripping with disdain. "A conspiracy? No, that's too generous a word. This isn't some shadowy plot hatched in a basement. This is deliberate. This is systematic. This is a cold-blooded campaign by Labour and their establishment cronies to remake Britain in their image, while keeping you, the public, blissfully ignorant." He seized another document from his arsenal, his movements deliberate, his intent unmistakable. "Let me pose a question," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Why is it that every time the British people demand something, Brexit, tougher immigration laws, control over our economy, those demands vanish into thin air the moment Labour takes power? Do you honestly believe that's coincidence?" He shook the paper in his hand, his tone rising with indignation. "This memo, straight from a Labour whistleblower, outlines a strategy they call public adaptation versus internal stabilization. It's a fancy way of saying they'll lie to your face while keeping their real agenda locked away in the shadows. When you voted for Brexit, they swore they'd respect your will, but behind closed doors, they were already scheming to drag us back into the EU's grip, regulation by regulation, until the referendum was nothing but a distant memory." The host swallowed hard, the enormity of the revelation threatening to overwhelm him. But Farage pressed on, relentless in his pursuit of truth. "And it gets darker," he said, flipping to another page with a flourish. "Here's a leaked memo from a meeting with corporate donors, Labour's paymasters. It states, and I quote, 'Increasing the workforce through strategic migration must be framed in a way that aligns with public sentiment while ensuring long-term quotas remain unaffected.' Translation? They're keeping the borders wide open, flooding Britain with cheap labour, all while feeding you platitudes about sensible control. They're not just betraying you, they're laughing at you while they do it." The tension in the studio was suffocating, a palpable force that pressed against every soul present. The audience, both in the room and at home, sat transfixed, their minds reeling as the layers of deception were stripped away. This was no longer about politics. This was about survival. Farage knew he had struck a nerve, and he revelled in it, not out of arrogance, but out of a burning conviction that the British people deserved to know the truth, no matter how brutal. "The establishment has thrived in the dark for too long," he said, his voice a clarion call. "They've spun their tales, controlled the narrative, kept you distracted with petty squabbles while they sold your country out from under you. But tonight, that ends. Tonight, the light shines on their sins, and they cannot hide." The host, his voice trembling, made one last attempt to stem the tide. Nigel, these are staggering accusations. Are you saying the entire Labour leadership is complicit? Farage's eyes narrowed, his response a dagger to the heart. I'm saying they don't lead, they follow. Labour isn't run by the faces you see on your screens. It's a puppet show, orchestrated by unelected bureaucrats, corporate overlords, and foreign powers who pull the strings from the shadows. And every time you, the people, dare to demand change, they tighten the noose, silencing you, mocking you, ensuring their grip on power remains unbroken. A chill swept through the room, the truth sinking in with a weight that was almost unbearable. For millions of Britons, Labour had been a beacon, a party of the people, a defender of the downtrodden. But now, that illusion lay in tatters, shredded by the documents Farage wielded like a weapon. The betrayal wasn't just political. It was personal, a wound inflicted on every citizen who had ever placed their faith in the system. And yet, as devastating as this was, Farage's next revelation would prove even more chilling. A final, irrefutable proof that the very essence of British democracy hung by a thread, imperiled by the very leaders sworn to protect it. The silence that followed was deafening, a void filled only by the pounding hearts of those who bore witness. The host, his composure in ruins, shifted uneasily, while the painelists sat like statues, petrified by the storm Farage had unleashed. But he was not done, not by a long shot. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing every ear to strain for his next words. "You want to talk about betrayal?" he said, his tone laced with a quiet menace that belied the fire in his eyes. "Let's discuss something the mainstream media won't dare touch, something so vile, so incriminating, that if the British public truly grasped its scope, Labour's entire edifice would collapse in a single night." He tapped the stack of documents before him, each page a testament to the treachery he was about to unveil. "These aren't just memos or emails," he said, his voice rising with each word. "These are contracts, binding, secret agreements forged in the shadows. And they prove, beyond any doubt, that Labour has been selling Britain's soul to foreign powers while feeding you lies to keep you docile." A murmur of disbelief swept through the studio, the host stiffening as if struck. "What do you mean by selling out?" he demanded, his voice cracking under the strain. "You can't just hurl accusations like that without proof." Farage's smirk was a blade, sharp and unyielding. "Proof," he said, pulling a document from the pile and thrusting it toward the cameras. "Here's your proof, a signed agreement between Labour officials and a multinational lobbying firm tied to foreign governments. Dated before the last election, it promises to align British policy with the European Union, post-Brexit, mind you, while Labour stood on stages swearing to honour your vote. They reassured Brussels that the UK would remain shackled to EU laws, just under a different banner. This isn't politics, this is treason." The audience at home reeled, the revelation hitting like a tidal wave. But Farage pressed on, his momentum unstoppable. "And that's not all," he said, flipping to another page with a flourish. "Here's a classified financial report from Labour's inner sanctum. It details how key figures have colluded with international banks to funnel British taxpayer money into foreign infrastructure projects. Billions siphoned off while they claim there's no cash to help struggling families here at home. They're not just robbing you. They're handing your wealth to strangers overseas." The host, now drenched in sweat, grasped at straws. "Nigel, these documents, where did they come from? Are they verified?" Farage's laugh was cold, cutting. "That's the establishment's trick, isn't it? When the truth emerges, they don't investigate, they discredit. But these papers have been authenticated by independent sources. Labour won't deny them, they can't. They'll spin, they'll deflect, but they won't call them fake, because the truth is staring them in the face." The implications were staggering, a betrayal so vast it defied comprehension. But Farage's final blow was yet to come, a revelation so profound it would expose the Labour Party not just as deceivers, but as architects of a plot to dismantle British democracy itself. The studio braced itself, the air thick with dread, as Farage prepared to deliver the coup de grace. The tension was a living thing, coiling around the room like a serpent ready to strike. The host, his authority in tatters, struggled to regain footing, but Farage had already shattered the illusion. This was no longer a debate. It was a trial, with the Labour Party in the dock and the British people as the jury. The documents in Farage's hands were not mere papers, they were indictments, each one a nail in the coffin of a political class that had dared to betray its own nation. And now, there was no turning back. Farage leaned in, his eyes locking with the camera as if addressing every betrayed soul watching from their living rooms. "For years, we've been told democracy is sacred," he said, his voice a low rumble that built into a crescendo. "We've been told our voices matter, that the leaders we elect serve us. But what if I told you it's all a sham? What if I told you the politicians you trusted, the ones who promised you a brighter future, were never working for you at all?" He slammed his hand on the desk, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. They were working for themselves, and worse, for foreign masters who own them, body and soul. The host stammered, his words tripping over themselves, but Farage was relentless. "Let's talk about Brexit," he said, his voice thick with indignation. "The greatest act of democratic defiance in our history. 17.4 million of you stood up to the elite, defied their threats, and voted to take back our country. And what did Labour do? They spent years trying to strangle it in its crib." He brandished another document, shaking it like a battle standard. This memo, from a secret meeting with EU officials before the 2019 election, proves Labour vowed to revisit Brexit's terms and explore renewed economic alignment with Brussels. "They plan to betray your vote from the start, to keep us tethered to the EU, referendum be damned." A gasp rippled through the audience, the betrayal cutting deeper with every word. But Farage wasn't finished. "And it's not just Brexit," he said, his voice hardening. "It's about who really runs this country. Remember when Keir Starmer stood in Parliament, swearing to put British workers first? To rebuild trust? To fight for fairness?" He unfolded another document with deliberate care, his eyes never leaving the camera. This contract, between Labour and a cabal of international investors, including a major party donor, promises to fast-track foreign work visas and gut employment laws to favour multinational corporations. They're not just outsourcing jobs, they're selling entire industries while British workers rot on the sidelines. The host's face drained of colour. "Are you saying Labour agreed to betray British workers?" Farage's smile was grim, unyielding. "I'm saying they've already done it. And they've got the gall to stand there, pretending they're your champions, while they stab you in the back." The studio trembled with the weight of his words, but Farage's next revelation would push the stakes even higher. He took a slow, deliberate breath, his voice dropping to a tone that chilled the blood. "Now, I want to tell you something that should terrify every Briton watching tonight, something that transcends politics, something that threatens the very survival of our democracy." The room fell into an eerie hush, the anticipation unbearable. "There's a reason the establishment has fought so hard to silence me," Farage said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "There's a reason they fear the truth breaking free. Because if you ever truly understood who's pulling the strings, this country would erupt in revolt." He gripped the desk, his knuckles whitening. "What if I told you Labour has been negotiating with global institutions to strip away Britain's sovereignty? That they've made secret pacts to hand over control of our laws, our taxes, our security to unelected bureaucrats abroad? That if they succeed, we'll be nothing more than a vassal state, a puppet dancing on foreign strings." The host gulped, his voice barely a whisper. "Nigel, what are you saying?" Farage held up another document, his hand steady as stone. "I'm saying Keir Starmer and his cronies have been working with international bodies to sign agreements that will gut our ability to govern ourselves. I'm saying that if Labour wins, we're on the brink of losing everything. Our freedom, our independence, our very identity as a nation." The gasps were audible, the revelation a thunderbolt that shattered any lingering illusions. "And don't just take my word for it," Farage continued, his voice rising with urgency. "Ask yourself, why does the media bury these deals? Why does Labour never campaign on them, yet always push them through once they're in power? Because they don't serve you, they serve their overlords." The studio was a mausoleum, the silence a testament to the gravity of what had been revealed. Farage let the moment linger, then delivered his final, crushing blow. "The British people have been lied to, exploited, and betrayed," he said, his voice a quiet roar. "We stand at a precipice. Either we rise up and fight for our nation, or we watch as the country we love is stolen from us, piece by piece, lie by lie." The audience was stunned, the host mute, and for the first time in years, the establishment's mask had been ripped away, exposing the rock beneath. The weight of Farage's words settled over the studio like a shroud, the air thick with a tension that could snap at any moment. The audience, the host, the millions watching at home, all felt it. This was no ordinary night. This was a turning point, A moment where the illusion of democracy trembled under the weight of truth. Farage let the silence stretch, his eyes burning with a fire that refused to be extinguished. Then, slowly, he leaned back, his fingers drumming a steady rhythm on the desk as he addressed the camera once more. Not the host, not the panel, but the people of Britain. So now the question is yours, he said, his voice lower now, but hedged with an unyielding resolve. What happens next? Do you swallow this betrayal? Do you let the establishment keep spinning their web of lies, keep scheming in the dark, keep dismantling your country while you sleep? Or do you fight? The host, his nerves frayed to breaking, cleared his throat and tried to interject. Nigel, you're making some very serious claims. Are you suggesting that Keir Starmer and Labour? But Farage silenced him with a look, his response a whip-crack of defiance. I'm not making claims. I'm presenting evidence. These documents aren't theories. They're facts. They prove Labour's plotted to betray Brexit, to sell out our workers, to surrender our sovereignty to global elites. And worst of all, they think you're too blind to care. The host shifted, desperation creeping into his voice. But surely, Nigel, if this were true, the media would report it, other politicians would speak out. Farage's laugh was sharp, bitter, a sound that cut through the pretense like a blade. In on it, he said, the words a hammer blow. The establishment, Labour, the Tories, the media, they're all complicit. They thrive on your ignorance, on your division. They know that if you saw the full picture, their house of cards would collapse. And they'll do anything, to keep that from happening. The host, sweating profusely, grasped at one last straw. So what are you saying, that democracy in Britain is a sham? Farage didn't flinch. I'm saying it's under attack, he replied, his voice a clarion call. I'm saying the people you elect to serve you are serving themselves, and their foreign paymasters. I'm saying Labour, under Starmer, isn't a party, it's a machine, built to keep you docile while they tear this nation apart. The tension was unbearable, the audience at home likely clutching their seats, their minds racing as the truth sank in. Could it be? Could the betrayal run this deep? Could everything they'd believed about their government be a lie? Farage exhaled slowly, his expression darkening. Let me ask you this, he said, his voice a quiet storm. Why do you think they despise me? Why have they spent years trying to crush me, to smear me, to erase me? It's not because I'm wrong. It's not because I'm some radical lunatic. It's because I speak the truth, and the truth is their kryptonite. The host shook his head, flustered. But Nigel, the country's more divided than ever. Some will say you're just fanning the flames, exaggerating for effect. Farage's eyes flashed, his response a thunderbolt. Divided? This country isn't divided. It's been broken, deliberately, by the very people who rule it. They want you at each other's throats, over Brexit, over borders, over culture, so you don't see the real enemy. They keep you distracted while they plunder your future. The host had no answer, his words failing him as Farage pressed on, his voice rising with a passion that shook the room. But there's one more thing you need to know. One final truth that should chill you to your core. The host gulped, his voice a whisper. What? What do you mean? Farage's expression was grim, his words measured but devastating. If Labour wins the next election, they won't let go of power again. The studio gasped, the host blinking in disbelief. You're not saying they'd... Farage cut him off, his voice a blade. I'm saying they've been laying the groundwork for a permanent grip on this country. A system where you'll never unseat them, no matter how you vote. They're crafting policies to dismantle every safeguard, to rig every election, to lock in their rule for generations. The audience was frozen, the host speechless, as Farage leaned forward one last time, his voice a whisper that carried the weight of a scream. If you don't wake up now, you may never get another chance. The room fell silent, the truth laid bare, the warning delivered. Britain's fate now rested in the hands of its people. And the clock was ticking. The silence was a living entity, a suffocating force that enveloped the studio as Farage's final words echoed in the void. The host sat paralyzed, his face a mask of shock, his carefully honed veneer of control shattered beyond repair. The audience, both in the room and across the nation, felt the weight of a moment that transcended politics, a moment where the very soul of Britain hung in the balance. Farage let the silence linger, a deliberate pause that allowed the gravity of his revelations to seep into every corner of the country. Then, with a slow, measured breath, he turned his gaze to the camera, speaking not to the host, not to the establishment watching from their gilded cages, but to the British people themselves. "You've heard the truth tonight," he said, his voice steady, unyielding, a beacon in the darkness. "And now, it's up to you. You can turn away, pretend this is just another storm that'll pass, convince yourself it's all too big, too messy, too impossible to fight. You can let the establishment keep lying, keep scheming, keep stealing your country while you sleep." His eyes darkened, his tone sharpening. "Or you can open your eyes. You can see the betrayal for what it is, not just politics, but a war on your freedom, your future, your very identity as a nation." The host, his voice trembling, made a final, feeble attempt to regain control. "Nigel, this is extraordinary. Are you saying we're on the verge of some kind of—" But Farage didn't let him finish, his response a thunderclap of urgency. "I'm saying we're running out of time. For too long, we've been lulled into complacency, fed lies about our democracy while the political class robbed us blind. They betrayed Brexit. They sold our sovereignty. They mocked us when we dared to resist. And now, they're coming for the last thing we have, our right to choose our own destiny." The host had nothing left, his words swallowed by the tide of Farage's conviction. "Look around you," Farage continued, his voice rising with a passion that shook the walls. "Everything that made Britain great is being torn apart. Our economy bled dry, our borders flung open, our institutions corrupted, and now, our democracy dangling by a thread. And the worst part? They think you're too weak to stop them." His eyes blazed, a fire igniting as he leaned into the camera. "But I know better. I know the British people aren't weak. I know we're not the kind to sit idly by while our nation is ripped from our hands. That's why I'm here, speaking these words, not because I relish the battle, but because someone has to sound the alarm." The host, grasping at straws, ventured a question. "And what do you propose, Nigel? What should the British people do?" Farage's answer was swift, unflinching. "Wake up," he said, his voice a command. "Start asking questions. Stop swallowing the lies they feed you every day. Demand answers, real answers, from the people who claim to serve you. Challenge them at every turn. Because if you don't, if you wait for someone else to save you, then by the time you see the truth, it'll be too late." A chill swept through the studio, the stark reality of his words sinking in. Farage exhaled, his voice steady but urgent. "History teaches us this. When people ignore the signs, when they tell themselves it can't happen here, that's when it does. Britain stands at a fork in the road. One path leads to freedom, to taking back our country, defending our values, standing against the elites who've betrayed us. The other," his jaw tightened, his words a warning carved in stone. "The other leads to a future where you own nothing, where your choices are dictated, where elections are a sham to prop up a rotting facade of democracy." He paused, letting the weight settle, then delivered his final, devastating strike. "And mark my words," he said, his voice a whisper that roared with power. "If Labour wins, if Starmer and his allies get their way, you'll never vote them out again." The audience gasped, the host froze, and the screen faded to black, leaving a nation in stunned silence. Farage's challenge hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown at the feet of every Briton. "The future of this country is in your hands," he had declared. "Not mine, not the politicians, not the media's, yours. What will you do with it?" And with that, the broadcast ended, the truth exposed, the battle lines drawn. The question now was not whether Farage was right, but whether the British people would rise to meet the moment, or let their nation slip into the abyss.